When Margaret Sullivan spent her last $278 to purchase an abandoned lighthouse at a coastal Maine bankruptcy auction, it was a desperate gamble to provide shelter for herself after losing everything. Following her husband's sudden death in a fishing boat accident and the crushing medical bills that consumed their savings, she never imagined that behind a hidden panel in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, she would discover a secret basement containing meticulously preserved World War II naval maps, tactical annotations, and a personal journal belonging to Rear Admiral Robert Caldwell, documents revealing a classified German U-boat hunting operation and identifying the locations of 23 unrecovered shipwrecks containing historical artifacts and precious metals worth millions of dollars. Before we continue, let us know where you are watching from in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, hit subscribe right now because tomorrow we have something special just for you. The foreclosure notice arrived on a foggy Thursday morning, tucked between an electric bill and a community newsletter, as if its life-shattering contents were just another mundane piece of mail. Notice of eviction, 30 days to vacate premises. Margaret Sullivan stared at the bold red letters, feeling her world collapse as she stood in the small kitchen of her one-bedroom cottage. Through the window, she could see the turbulent gray ocean that had been both companion and tormentor since Frank's passing 6 months ago. At 62, Margaret hadn't imagined she would be here, a widow with a teaching degree, recently forced into early retirement, when her small coastal school consolidated and now facing homelessness in a rental market that seemed designed to exclude people exactly like her. She placed the eviction notice on the counter and took a deep breath, mentally calculating her options. Her savings had dwindled to just $278.15 after months of medical bills and funeral expenses. Frank's health insurance had covered only a fraction of the $127,000 in treatments for the aggressive cancer that had taken him just weeks after diagnosis. Their modest retirement fund, already diminished by the 2008 recession, had been depleted entirely. Her sister lived across the country and was in no position to help. Friends had already assisted as much as they could during the initial weeks after Frank's death. Margaret moved to the living room window, gazing out at the lighthouse that stood sentinel on the rocky point beyond her cottage. For 30 years, it had been the backdrop to her marriage with Frank, its beams sweeping over their cottage each night like a protective guardian. Now it was as abandoned as she felt decommissioned 5 years ago, when automated navigation systems had rendered human lighthouse keepers obsolete. She picked up the framed photograph of Frank in his fishing gear, standing proudly beside his boat, the Sea Wanderer. A lifetime of hauling lobster traps and navigating the treacherous Maine waters had etched deep lines into his weathered face, but his eyes still held the same spark of life they had when they'd met at a harbor dance in 1986. Before serving on the USS Nimitz, Frank had been a third-generation fisherman, and he'd returned to the family trade after his service content with the rhythm of the tides and the honest work of providing for his community. "What would you do now, my love?" she asked the silent image. That afternoon, Margaret walked the half-mile into Seaport Harbor, a fishing community of 200 souls that had seen better days. The Harbor Cafe still served as the town's gathering place, its windows fogged with condensation from coffee urns and conversations. Margaret pushed open the door, greeted by the familiar bell and the scent of Betty's famous blueberry muffins. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Betty called from behind the counter. At 48, Betty had once been Margaret's 7th grade history student, now the proprietor of the cafe her parents had opened in the 1970s. "Coffee's on the house today." "Betty, you can't keep doing that," Margaret protested weakly, though her dwindling bank account appreciated the gesture. "My cafe, my rules," Betty replied with a wink, sliding a steaming mug across the counter. "Besides, without you teaching me about the Civil War, I'd never have passed Mr. Peterson's high school history class." Margaret settled at her usual corner table, nodding to the regulars, mostly retired fishermen, who gathered each morning to debate weather patterns and politics with equal fervor. "Mind if I join you?" The deep voice belonged to Thomas Wilson, 75, the retired county judge, who had been Frank's chess partner and fishing companion for 2 decades. His tall frame was slightly stooped now, white hair thinning, but his blue eyes remained sharp and observant, the same eyes that had presided over the county courthouse for 27 years. Thomas settled his lanky frame into the wooden chair, placing a folded copy of the Lincoln County Gazette on the table. "Heard about your notice," he said without preamble. In small towns, news traveled faster than the morning tide. 30 days, Margaret confirmed, her fingers tightening around the warm mug, and nowhere to go. The rental market has doubled since the Boston crowd discovered our quaint coastal charm. Thomas nodded grimly. Same thing happened to Millie Peterson last year. She's living with her daughter in Bangor now. He pushed the newspaper toward her, one bony finger tapping a small advertisement. County bankruptcy auction. Saturday morning. Margaret scanned the notice, which listed various foreclosed properties being liquidated to recoup county taxes. Most were vacant lots or dilapidated houses requiring massive renovations. And then she saw at item number 17, former Cape Unity Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters. Minimum bid $200, sold as is. The Lighthouse, Margaret looked up, puzzled. Why would the county sell it? Isn't it a historical property? Thomas stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Historical designation lapsed when the Coast Guard decommissioned it in 2010. County's been trying to find a preservation partner for years, but no takers. Maintenance costs too high, location too remote. They're cutting their losses. But what would I do with an abandoned lighthouse? Margaret asked, though something made her continue studying the listing. Live in it, perhaps, Thomas suggested. The keeper's quarters are a decent size, about 1,200 square feet. 2 bedrooms, if I recall correctly. Solid stone construction, been standing against Atlantic storms since 1879. Sometimes when doors close, Margaret, it's not an ending. It's an opportunity to find another path. Saturday morning arrived with rare October sunshine. The county courthouse was an imposing granite structure with wide steps leading to heavy wooden doors. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early, clutching her bitter registration papers and trying to look more confident than she felt. The auction room was already half filled with people in business attire, professional investors, and developers who did this regularly. Thomas was waiting by the entrance, his tall frame easily visible above the crowd. Inside, they found seats near the back of the room. Thomas quietly pointed out the regular auction attendees, Jane Cooper from Cooper Real Estate, who specialized in flipping distressed coastal properties, Michael Dawson, who represented a Boston development group, and several local contractors looking for project opportunities. The auctioneer began precisely at 10 a.m., moving rapidly through the first 16 lots. Margaret watched as vacant lots sold for tens of thousands and dilapidated houses for even more. Her confidence wavered with each bang of the gavel. Lot 17, the auctioneer announced, former Cape Unity Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters. Structure approximately 143 years old. Stone construction with attached 2-story dwelling. Property sold as is. All utilities disconnected. Access via causeway, title conditions permitting. Minimum bid $200. A slide appeared on the projection screen showing the lighthouse, its white paint weathered to a dull gray windows, boarded, surrounded by rocky terrain and crashing waves. Not a single hand raised at the initial call for bids. $200, the auctioneer repeated. Do I have an opening bid? The room remained silent. Margaret felt her heart hammering in her chest, Thomas's encouraging nod, giving her the courage to slowly raise her paddle. $200 from bidder number 42, the auctioneer acknowledged. Do I have $225 too? Margaret's dismay, Jane Cooper casually raised her paddle. $225 from bidder number 4. Do I hear $250? Margaret raised her paddle again, silently calculating that she could go no higher than $278, her entire remaining savings. $250 from bidder number 42. Do I hear $275? Saw it done. Jane Cooper glanced back at Margaret and, assessing her competition, then raised her paddle again. $275. Margaret's stomach sank. She had only 278 of 15s in her account, not enough to outbid Cooper if she went higher. With trembling hands, she raised her paddle one final time. $278, she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. Several heads turned at the odd amount. $278 from bidder 42, the auctioneer confirmed. Do I hear $300? Jane Cooper turned again, studying Margaret for a long moment, then shook her head slightly and returned to her notes. The room fell silent. $278 going once, going twice. The auctioneer scanned the room. Sold to bidder number 42 for $278. The sharp crack of the gavel made Margaret jump. Had that really just happened? Had she actually purchased a lighthouse for less than the security deposit on most apartments? "Congratulations, lighthouse keeper," Thomas said with a smile, his weathered hand patting her shoulder. "You just bought yourself a piece of Maine history." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork signatures and transaction processing. The county clerk explained that the property had been abandoned for nearly 13 years, with property taxes unpaid since the Coast Guard had transferred ownership to the county, which had failed to find a preservation partner. By noon, Margaret Sullivan, widow, retired history teacher, and now owner of a defunct lighthouse, clutched a set of keys and property deed in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "What have I done?" she whispered to Thomas as they exited the courthouse. "Something brave," he replied simply. "Now let's go see your new home." The drive to Cape Unity took them along increasingly narrow coastal roads past summer cottages now boarded up for the season and marshlands where herons stood in silent contemplation. The lighthouse sat at the end of a narrow causeway that connected to the mainland, accessible only when the tide was low enough to keep the rough stone path above water. Margaret parked her aging Honda Civic where the paved road ended and the causeway began. The afternoon tide was retreating, leaving wet stones and scattered seaweed in its wake. The lighthouse stood proudly against the blue October sky, its limestone tower weathered but still impressive at 96 feet tall. The attached keeper's quarters was a two-story stone building that matched the tower with a steep slate roof and shuttered windows facing the ocean. Using the key from the auction, Margaret unlocked the heavy wooden door to the keeper's quarters. The smell hit her first, the distinctive scent of a long-abandoned space salt dust and old wood. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating floating dust particles and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The main living area was approximately 20 feet square, with a stone fireplace along one wall. Abandoned furniture remained draped in dusty sheets, a dining table, chairs, a writing desk, and bookcases built into the walls. A narrow hallway led to what had been the kitchen, small room with an ancient cast-iron stove, a sink with a hand pump, and open shelving along the walls. Beyond that was another room that might have been a pantry or storage area. A steep staircase led to the second floor, which contained two bedrooms with iron bed frames still in place, and a small bathroom with a clawfoot tub and pedestal sink. No electricity, no running water, and plenty of work needed, Thomas summarized, running a hand along a window frame. But the structure is sound. These walls are 2 feet thick in places. They don't build them like this anymore. A door at the back of the lower hallway connected the quarters to the lighthouse tower itself, where a spiral staircase wound upward to the lantern room, 87 steps, that Margaret counted as she climbed, carefully testing each metal step before trusting it with her full weight. The lantern room at the top took her breath away, not just from the climb, but from the panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean stretching to the horizon. The massive Fresnel lens had been removed when the lighthouse was decommissioned, but the metal framework remained along with the rotation mechanism that had once turned the light. "I can see why lighthouse keepers love their solitude," Margaret said softly, gazing out at the endless blue. "It feels like the edge of the world." "It's a special place," Thomas agreed. "Frank and I used to fish near here. He always said the lighthouse looked like it was keeping watch over everyone who went to sea." The mention of Frank brought a fresh wave of grief, but also something unexpected, a sense that perhaps he had guided her here somehow. This lighthouse had been part of their view for 30 years. Now it would be her sanctuary. The following morning, Thomas arrived at Margaret's cottage with Robert Hayes, a robust 68-year-old with calloused hands, and a pickup truck loaded with lumber tools and supplies. Robert's son Michael, a 45-year-old who had followed his father into the construction trade, accompanied them. "Judge Wilson says you bought yourself a lighthouse," Robert said by way of greeting, his Maine accent thick as molasses. "Always wanted to work on one of those. Historic structures have stories in their walls." They caravanned to the lighthouse, timing their arrival with the morning's low tide. Robert and Michael immediately began a thorough inspection, their experienced eyes noting every crack, weak spot, and potential problem. "Roof's not as bad as it could be," Robert reported after climbing up with Michael to check the slate tiles. "Some leaks around the chimney flashing, and a few cracked slates, but fixable before the next storm." While the men worked on the roof, Margaret began clearing debris from the keeper's quarters, as uncovering furnishings that had been left behind when the lighthouse was decommissioned. Beneath dusty sheets, she found solid oak pieces from the early 20th century, A dining table with 6 chairs, a writing desk, 2 armchairs, and various side tables. With cleaning and minor repairs, they would be serviceable again. In a bureau drawer, Margaret discovered a collection of black and white photographs showing the lighthouse and its keepers throughout the decades. One image in particular caught her attention, a naval officer in full-dress uniform standing in front of Cape Unity Lighthouse. The man's stern expression contrasted with the pride evident in his posture, one hand resting on the lighthouse door. The inscription at the bottom read, Rear Admiral Robert Caldwell, Naval Intelligence, Eastern Seaboard Defense Command, 1946. Margaret studied the photograph with professional interest. As a history teacher, she had specialized in American maritime history, including the naval campaigns of World War II. Caldwell's name was vaguely familiar from her studies. Something to do with convoy protections against German U-boats. Found some treasure, Thomas asked, joining her after helping Robert secure a tarp over a section of the roof. History, Margaret replied, showing him the photograph. A naval admiral with some connection to this lighthouse. Thomas adjusted his glasses, studying the image. Interesting. The war had been over for a year by then. Wonder what brought naval intelligence to a remote Maine lighthouse. For the next week, Margaret divided her time between packing her belongings at the cottage and working on basic repairs at the lighthouse. Thomas, Robert, and Michael devoted their mornings to the most critical structural issues, securing the roof, replacing broken windows, and ensuring the stone walls remained watertight. Robert proved to be not just a skilled craftsman, but an excellent teacher, showing Margaret how to make basic repairs herself. No sense in calling a handyman for every loose hinge or stuck window, he explained, demonstrating how to properly sand and rehang a warped door. Lighthouse keeping is all about self-sufficiency. By the second weekend, Margaret had cleared enough space in the keeper's quarters to begin moving in essential belongings. The kitchen now had a propane camp stove for cooking and heating water. Battery-powered lanterns provided light until proper electrical service could be restored. Thomas had arranged for a water delivery service to fill a holding tank they'd installed, creating a rudimentary but functional plumbing system. It's primitive, Margaret acknowledged, as she sat with Thomas on the stone steps outside the lighthouse, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and pink. But it's mine. No landlord can evict me now. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission might be interested in your project, Thomas mentioned, passing her a thermos of coffee. They offer grants for lighthouse restoration. Not enough to cover everything, but it would help with the major expenses. That night, Margaret spent her first night in the lighthouse, wrapped in blankets, in one of the old armchairs beside the fireplace that Robert had certified safe to use. The stone walls kept out the worst of the late October chill, and the crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the Atlantic waves crashed against the rocky shore in a rhythm as old as time itself. Despite the rustic conditions, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This place had stood against storms for almost a century and a half. It had witnessed war and peace, boom times, and depression generations of keepers tending its light. Now she was part of that continuum, not just seeking shelter, but becoming a guardian of maritime history. She dozed off with Admiral Caldwell's photograph in her lap, wondering what connection this naval officer had to her lighthouse, never suspecting that by the end of the following week, that question would lead to a discovery that would change everything. After a week of intensive work, the keeper's quarters had been transformed from an abandoned shell to a basic but livable space. Margaret had officially moved in, saying goodbye to her coastal cottage with mixed emotions. Though she missed the familiar comfort of her former home, the lighthouse offered something the cottage never could: security and permanence, in a world that had become frighteningly unstable since Frank's death. With essential repairs complete, Margaret turned her attention to exploring the lighthouse more thoroughly. She spent a full day organizing the logbooks and historical materials. She'd found her teacher's methodical nature creating order from decades of accumulated records. One keeper from the 1950s wrote eloquently about the philosophical aspects of his solitary profession. To keep the light is to stand between worlds, between land and sea, between safety and peril, between darkness and illumination. We do not simply tend a lamp, we maintain the boundary between these realms. Margaret was examining the kitchen space, mentally converting it into a functional modern cooking area when something caught her attention. The wall behind where an old refrigerator had stood didn't look quite right. Most of the interior walls were plaster over stone, but this section had different texturing and the baseboard didn't quite match the rest of the room. Curious, Margaret examined the wall more carefully. Running her fingers along the edge where it met the floor, she felt a slight draft impossible for an interior wall unless it wasn't solid all the way through. Pressing against different sections of the wall, she noticed one panel gave slightly under pressure. Looking more closely at the panel, Margaret noticed a small metal plate near the floor that appeared to be decorative but didn't match any other fixtures in the room. Pressing it experimentally, she felt it give way under her touch. A soft click emanated from inside the wall, and the panel shifted inward slightly. Heart racing, Margaret pushed against the panel, which swung inward on hidden hinges, to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Using the flashlight on her phone, she illuminated stone steps leading down below the keeper's quarters into what must be a basement or cellar not mentioned in any of the property documentation. The staircase was solidly constructed, each step carved from a single block of stone. Counting as she descended, Margaret reached 15 steps before the stairs opened into a room approximately 12 feet square with a low ceiling that forced her to stoop slightly. Unlike the abandoned living spaces above, this room showed signs of deliberate preservation. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, their surfaces free of the dust that covered everything upstairs. A large table occupied the center of the room, its surface protected by a heavy canvas covering. Along another wall stood a wooden chest with brass fittings and a serious-looking lock. Margaret approached the table first, carefully removing the canvas cover to reveal what lay beneath. She gasped at the sight. Spread across the table surface was a large-format naval map of the Atlantic Ocean, focused on shipping lanes between North America and Europe. The map was covered with handwritten annotations, tactical markings, and color-coded pins still embedded in specific locations. The map appeared to be from World War II, showing convoy routes, naval patrol sectors, and most surprisingly, locations marked with the red X's labeled with dates and cryptic annotations like U-512 confirmed or Liberty Ship Cargo Manifest B7. Moving to the filing cabinets, Margaret discovered they were unlocked. The first drawer she opened contained folders organized by date, each holding detailed reports, smaller maps, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs of vessels. The label on the drawer read, North Atlantic Theater, 1942-1943 ADMRC. The second cabinet contained similar materials for 1944 to 1945, while a third held what appeared to be personal correspondence and handwritten journals. All the materials were in remarkable condition, preserved in the cool, dry environment of the sealed underground room. As she carefully returned the canvas covering to the map table, Margaret noticed the photograph in a simple frame hanging on the wall near the staircase. It was another copy of the image she had found upstairs, Admiral Caldwell, standing in front of the lighthouse. Now the connection was becoming clear. Somehow this naval officer had used Cape Unity Lighthouse as a secret archive for his wartime intelligence work. Margaret spent hours in the hidden room, carefully examining documents, but taking care not to disturb their organization. The journals proved particularly illuminating. Written in Admiral Caldwell's precise handwriting, they detailed his work in naval intelligence from 1942 through 1957, including his tactical decisions, strategic assessments, and personal reflections on the cost of war. One entry from March 15, 1943 caught her attention. Made the decision to route convoy HX-229 through dangerous waters today. Know full well the Wolfpack is waiting, but no alternative if supplies are to reach European front on schedule. The burden of these decisions grows heavier with each passing month. When I close my eyes, I see the faces of men I've never met but have effectively sent to their potential deaths. Is this the true meaning of command? Another entry from May 7, 1945 was equally revealing. Victory in Europe declared today. The Atlantic Theater has cost us dearly. 2,779 merchant vessels, sunk according to current tallies, though my own records indicate the number is closer to 2,710 when accounting for unconfirmed losses. The location data I've compiled represents not just strategic information, but a maritime graveyard map. These vessels and their brave crews deserve to be remembered properly, not lost to bureaucratic imprecision or wartime secrecy. Margaret found a specific section dedicated to something called Project Compass Rose, apparently a classified naval intelligence operation aimed at disrupting German U-boat networks through advanced tracking and deception tactics. The project details included innovative methods for predicting U-boat movements and protecting Allied shipping, many of which seemed ahead of their time in terms of tactical sophistication. As the afternoon light began to fade, Margaret reluctantly prepared to leave the hidden room. She had barely scratched the surface of the archive's contents, but already recognized its immense historical significance. These weren't just old military records, they were the personal documentation of a key naval intelligence figure preserved outside official channels for reasons she had yet to fully understand. Carefully securing the hidden panel behind her, Margaret climbed the stone steps to the keeper's quarters, her mind racing with implications. Her 278-acre lighthouse hadn't just provided potential shelter. It had given her access to historical materials that could be academically priceless. The sun was setting as Margaret locked up her new property and called Thomas, her voice trembling with excitement. "I need to show you something," she said. "Something important. Can you come to the lighthouse tomorrow morning?" "Of course," he replied, concern evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Margaret assured him, "but I think I've found something significant. Something that changes everything." Thomas arrived early the next morning, his pickup truck navigating the causeway just as the tide reached its lowest point. Margaret met him at the door, her excitement barely contained. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed, following her into the keeper's quarters. "I haven't," she admitted, "not since what I found yesterday." She led him to the kitchen and demonstrated the hidden mechanism that revealed the concealed door. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. A secret room. Didn't see that in the property listing." Together, they descended the stone steps into Admiral Caldwell's archive. Thomas, with his legal background, immediately grasped the significance of what they were seeing. "This is extraordinary," he said, carefully examining the annotated maps. "These appear to be original naval intelligence documents from World War II. Some of this material might still be classified." "It's more than just historical documents," Margaret explained, showing him the detailed shipwreck coordinates. "Admiral Caldwell recorded the exact locations of 23 vessels sunk during the war. 7 military vessels, 9 civilian ships carrying military cargo, and 7 purely commercial vessels. And look at this." She handed him a folder containing manifest details for the commercial ships. The SS William Bradford was carrying industrial diamonds worth millions in today's market. The SS Northern Light had art treasures evacuated from European museums before the German occupation. This information could be incredibly valuable to salvage operations. Thomas whistled softly. No wonder he kept it hidden. This isn't just history, it's a treasure map. "Which raises the question," Margaret said, sinking onto the room's only chair. "What do I do with it? I'm facing financial ruin, Thomas. The information in this room could potentially solve all my problems. But it also belongs to history, to the families of those who were lost on these ships, to the museums that lost their artifacts." Thomas considered for a long moment, his judicial temperament evident in his measured response. "There are legal and ethical considerations here. Maritime salvage law is complex, especially when it involves military vessels. The Navy would certainly assert jurisdiction over their ships. The commercial vessels are a different matter. Traditional salvage rights might apply. But there's more at stake than just legal ownership," Margaret insisted. "Admiral Caldwell preserved these records for a reason. His journals suggest he wanted the truth preserved when official records might be sanitized or incomplete." "What would Frank do?" Thomas asked quietly. The question struck Margaret deeply. Frank, with his naval service and unwavering sense of honor, would have approached this discovery with reverence and responsibility, not merely as an opportunity for personal gain. "He would do the right thing," she answered finally, "whatever that is." "Then that's where we start," Thomas said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's begin by consulting experts who can help us understand what we're dealing with, the historians who specialize in naval operations and maritime law. We need to establish the historical significance before considering any financial implications." Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly. "I was thinking of contacting the New England Maritime Historical Society. They have experts in naval history who could authenticate these materials without immediately involving government agencies." "Good thinking," Thomas agreed. "And in the meantime, we should improve security here. This discovery is too important to leave unprotected." That night, back in the sparsely furnished keeper's quarters, Margaret researched Admiral Robert Caldwell, finding limited but consistent information online. A distinguished naval career spanning 4 decades, significant contributions to convoy protection strategies during World War II, and a reputation for meticulous record-keeping and unconventional tactics. After the war, he had served on various naval intelligence committees until his retirement in 1957, after which public records showed he had purchased a property near Seaport Harbor, almost certainly the lighthouse where he had established his hidden archive. An entry from 1957 near the end of the logbook provided critical context. Upon my retirement today, I have completed the transfer of all official materials to Naval Intelligence Archives, save for my personal records and the specialized charts maintained here at Cape Unity. The official history will record what Washington deems appropriate, but my archive will preserve the unvarnished truth of our Atlantic operations, including convoy routes, engagement outcomes, and precise wreck locations, particularly those carrying significant historical or material value. Future generations may find purpose in recovering these lost vessels when technology permits safer exploration than currently possible. Margaret's research shifted to maritime salvage law and historical preservation requirements. The legal landscape was complex, with overlapping jurisdictions between state historic preservation offices, the Navy's historical department, and various federal agencies responsible for coastal waters and shipwrecks. One thing became clear: she needed to be careful about how she proceeded. The discovery in her lighthouse could attract attention from multiple directions, not all of it welcome or benevolent. The following morning, Margaret made the call to the New England Maritime Historical Society. After explaining her purchase of the lighthouse and hinting at a significant historical discovery, she secured an appointment with Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the Society's director, for the following afternoon. "Bring photographs if possible, but no original documents yet," Thomas advised as they prepared for the meeting. "We need to assess their reaction before entrusting them with access to the actual archive." Margaret spent the morning carefully photographing key pages from Admiral Caldwell's journals and several of the most significant maps, being careful not to disturb the original organization. The more she examined the materials, the more she appreciated their historical significance beyond the potential salvage value. Caldwell's tactical innovations had saved countless lives during the Battle of the Atlantic, developing convoy protection strategies that significantly reduced shipping losses to German U-boats. His journals revealed a commander deeply affected by the human cost of his decisions, recording not just strategic outcomes, but the names of ships and men lost under his command. One section particularly moved her: a personal list Caldwell maintained of every merchant vessel lost while following his routing instructions, with notes about their crews and cargo. "These men did not wear naval uniforms," he wrote, "yet they faced the same perils as any warship crew. Their sacrifice deserves recognition equal to any battleship sailor." That afternoon, Thomas drove Margaret to Portland for her appointment with Dr. Hayes. The New England Maritime Historical Society occupied a renovated warehouse overlooking the harbor, its brick walls and large windows maintaining the building's industrial character while housing one of the region's premier collections of maritime artifacts and documents. Dr. Eleanor Hayes was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair cut in a practical bob and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her office reflected her academic focus: bookshelves filled with naval histories, framed nautical charts, and model ships displayed in glass cases. "Judge Wilson speaks highly of your lighthouse project," Dr. Hayes said after initial introductions. "Cape Unity is an excellent example of mid-19th century coastal architecture with significant historical value. I'm committed to restoring it properly," Margaret replied, carefully choosing her next words. "In fact, I've already discovered some interesting historical elements that weren't mentioned in the property listing." Dr. Hayes's interest visibly heightened. "That's often the case with these structures." "What have you found?" Margaret took a calculated risk. "Documents and materials that appear to have belonged to Rear Admiral Robert Caldwell, who owned the lighthouse after his naval career. I believe they're historically significant and wanted to consult with an expert before proceeding." The historian's eyes widened. "Admiral Caldwell. His tactical innovations saved countless lives during the Battle of the Atlantic. Any personal papers would be of considerable academic interest." She paused, studying Margaret carefully. "What sort of materials are we discussing? Maps, journals, tactical annotations? What appears to be his personal archive from his naval intelligence work?" Margaret explained, opening her folder to share the photographs she'd taken. I wanted to ensure they're properly preserved and evaluated by qualified experts. This deliberately vague description omitted the shipwreck locations and potential salvage value, focusing instead on the historical significance that would most interest an academic like Dr. Hayes. The historian's response was measured but enthusiastic as she examined the photographs. These appear authentic based on the formatting and notations consistent with naval intelligence documents from that period. The handwriting matches examples of Caldwell's that we have in our collection. She looked up at Margaret with newfound respect. This could be a significant find for naval history scholars. The Society would be very interested in assessing these materials in person. I'd welcome your expertise, Margaret said carefully, though I want to maintain appropriate oversight as a property owner. Perhaps you could visit the lighthouse to make an initial assessment before any materials are removed for conservation. Dr. Hayes agreed readily to this approach, and they scheduled a visit for the following afternoon. As they finalized details, the historian offered unexpected information. You should know that your lighthouse has been of interest to several organizations over the years. The Navy's Historical Division made inquiries about purchasing it in the 1980s, but were deterred by county requirements for public access if they took ownership. This revelation added another layer to Margaret's understanding. The Navy had potentially known about Caldwell's archive, but had been unable to secure the property. Now that it was privately owned, different rules would apply to any materials discovered there. As Margaret left the meeting, her phone pinged with an email notification. The sender was unfamiliar Nathan Parker at navalhistory.gov. The message was brief. Regarding your purchase of Cape Unity Lighthouse Historical Preservation Division, would appreciate consultation regarding any materials of naval significance discovered on the property. Please call 202-555-0142 at your earliest convenience. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had notified the Navy about her meeting with Dr. Hayes, or they had been monitoring property transfers and had only now connected her purchase with their historical interest in the lighthouse. Margaret showed the email to Thomas as they drove back to Seaport Harbor. His expression grew concerned as he read it. They're moving quickly. That suggests they know exactly what might be in that lighthouse. Should I respond? Margaret asked. Not immediately, Thomas advised. Let's wait until after Dr. Hayes visits tomorrow. Her assessment will give us a stronger position from which to engage with the Navy. That evening, back at the lighthouse, Margaret continued exploring Admiral Caldwell's archive. In a folder labeled Vessel Manifest, Priority Recovery, she found detailed information about the 23 shipwrecks, including specifics about their cargo contents and potential value. The SS William Bradford, sunk in February 1943, had been carrying 300 tons of industrial diamonds intended for precision manufacturing. Estimated current value substantial, Caldwell had noted. Recovery priority high. The SS Northern Lights, sunk in October 1944, contained an art collection from Rotterdam museums, evacuated ahead of German occupation, including works by Vermeer and Rembrandt. Historical value incalculable, Caldwell wrote. Recovery status never attempted. Depth approximately 3,200 feet. The manifest represented potentially billions in recoverable materials and historical artifacts, their locations precisely documented in the maps spread across the center table. Information that would be invaluable to salvage operations museums and historical preservation efforts. As Margaret carefully returned the materials to their places, she noticed something she had overlooked during previous visits. A small metal plaque mounted beside the entry staircase. Its inscription reading, "Knowledge preserved serves no purpose unless shared. Wisdom is knowing when and how to share it." JRC. Admiral Caldwell had created this archive not to hide information permanently, but to preserve it until it could be properly utilized. The question now was how Margaret would honor that intention while protecting both the historical significance of the materials and her own interests. The following morning, Thomas called with troubling news. There have been people asking questions about you and your lighthouse purchase around town. A man identifying himself as a naval historian was at the county records office reviewing your purchase documentation. And I was approached yesterday by someone claiming to represent a maritime salvage investment group asking if I knew your renovation plans. This rapid escalation of outside interest was concerning. Barely 10 days had passed since her purchase, Yet multiple parties were already converging on her discovery. The naval representative was expected, given the email she'd received, but the salvage investment group suggested information was spreading through unofficial channels. "Thank you for letting me know," Margaret said, appreciating Thomas's vigilance. "We'll need to be careful about who we allow access to the lighthouse." "I'm happy to run interference if needed," Thomas offered. "After 30 years in this community, I know who can be trusted and who cannot." Hayes arrived at Cape Unity Lighthouse precisely at the scheduled time, her compact research vehicle navigating the causeway with practiced ease. Margaret had spent the morning preparing for this critical meeting, carefully considering how much to reveal about Admiral Caldwell's archive. "The Historical Society has been hoping someone would restore this property," Dr. Hayes said as Margaret led her through the keeper's quarters. "These lighthouses are irreplaceable maritime heritage." Margaret provided a brief tour of the main living spaces, discussing her renovation plans and the structural assessment she'd received. Dr. Hayes offered helpful suggestions about historical accuracy and preservation techniques, clearly impressed by Margaret's commitment to maintaining architectural integrity. "You mentioned finding documents related to Admiral Caldwell," Dr. Hayes said, finally, her professional interest evident. "That could significantly enhance the historical value of your restoration project." Margaret nodded, leading the historian to the kitchen area. "I discovered something unexpected during my initial inspection." She pressed the hidden panel, revealing the concealed staircase. Dr. Hayes's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "A hidden basement that's not in any of the lighthouse architectural records. It appears Admiral Caldwell had it constructed after purchasing the property," Margaret explained, leading the way down the stone steps. "What I found inside raises some interesting historical questions." The historian's gasp was audible as they entered the archive room, and Margaret illuminated it with battery-powered lanterns. Dr. Hayes moved immediately to the map table, her trained eye recognizing the significance of the materials before her. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, carefully examining the annotated naval charts. "These appear to be Admiral Caldwell's personal tactical maps from the Battle of the Atlantic. The detail is remarkable, far more precise than the official naval archives I've studied." Margaret watched carefully as Dr. Hayes moved methodically around the room, examining documents with growing excitement. She deliberately directed the historian's attention to the journals and tactical annotations, steering her away from the shipwreck manifest for now. "The historical value is immense," Dr. Hayes declared after 30 minutes of examination. "These materials provide unprecedented insight into naval intelligence operations during World War II. The academic community would consider this a significant discovery." "That's why I contacted you first," Margaret said, choosing her words deliberately. "I want to ensure these materials are properly preserved and studied. But as the property owner, I also want to maintain appropriate oversight of how they're handled." Dr. Hayes nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The Maritime Historical Society would propose a collaborative approach. We could provide conservation expertise and academic resources while you maintain ownership rights. Our primary interest is ensuring these materials are preserved and made available to qualified researchers." This aligned with Margaret's hopes for a balanced partnership rather than institutional appropriation of her discovery. "What would that collaboration look like in practical terms?" "We would suggest documenting everything in situ first, then transferring select materials to our conservation lab for preservation work," Dr. Hayes explained. "All items would remain your property, with the Society serving as steward for research access under your authorization." The approach seemed reasonable, though Margaret noted the historian hadn't mentioned the potential value of the shipwreck information. Either Dr. Hayes hadn't yet recognized that aspect of the archive, or she was strategically focusing on academic value first. "There was something else you should know," Margaret said, deciding transparency with her chosen partner was essential. "I received an email from the Naval Historical Division yesterday, and I've been told people have been asking questions about my lighthouse purchase." Dr. Hayes's expression shifted to concern. "That's unusually aggressive for initial contact. The Navy has protocols for historical discoveries that typically begin with formal written requests." "I thought it seemed premature," Margaret agreed, "which is why I wanted to consult with an independent expert before responding." "You made the right decision," Dr. Hayes assured her. "The Historical Society has extensive experience mediating between private property owners and government agencies. We can help ensure your rights are protected while facilitating appropriate historical preservation. As they continued discussing potential approaches, Margaret carefully raised the subject of the shipwreck information. Some of Admiral Caldwell's annotations appear to identify vessel locations with remarkable precision. Would that have particular historical significance? Dr. Hayes's expression confirmed she understood the implication. Significant indeed, accurate shipwreck locations from that era would be valuable to both historical research and potential recovery operations. Modern technology can reach wrecks that were inaccessible when these records were created. And if some of those vessels contain valuable cargo? Margaret asked directly. The historian met her gaze with professional candor. Maritime law is complex regarding salvage rights, particularly for wartime losses. However, as the discoverer of the location information, you would have certain legal standing in any recovery operations. She paused, considering her words carefully. The Society has partnerships with ethical marine archaeology organizations that approach shipwreck recovery with both historical respect and recognition of discoverers' rights. This was precisely the type of balanced perspective Margaret had hoped for: acknowledgement of the financial potential without focusing exclusively on exploitation. As they concluded their initial assessment, Dr. Hayes proposed a formal collaboration agreement that would protect Margaret's ownership rights while leveraging the Society's expertise and institutional connections. They scheduled a follow-up meeting with the Society's legal counsel to draft appropriate documents. One more thing, Dr. Hayes said as they climbed the stairs back to the kitchen. Be cautious in your communications with the Naval Historical Division. Their interest may extend beyond academic documentation to classified information and sovereign immunity claims over military vessels. I've been wondering about that, Margaret admitted. How much authority would they have over Admiral Caldwell's personal records? That's the complexity, Dr. Hayes explained. The line between his official duties and personal documentation is legally ambiguous, especially for intelligence materials. The Society can help you navigate those distinctions effectively. After Dr. Hayes departed, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic about their potential partnership. The historian had demonstrated both expertise and respect for her position as property owner, a promising foundation for handling the complex challenges ahead. Later that day, an email arrived from someone identifying themselves as Maxwell Prescott, Senior Acquisition Specialist with Triton Salvage. The message was direct. Miss Sullivan, congratulations on your Lighthouse acquisition. Our organization specializes in historical maritime recovery operations with a focus on World War II-era vessels. We understand the Cape Unity property may contain documentation relevant to our research interests. We would like to discuss a potential partnership that would be financially advantageous to both parties. Please call 305-585-7891 at your convenience to explore this opportunity. A quick internet search revealed the company was a private salvage operation with several successful recovery projects involving 20th century shipwrecks primarily in the Caribbean and South Atlantic. Their website emphasized ethical recovery practices and historical preservation partnerships, though several news articles highlighted controversies with government agencies over artifact ownership. Margaret decided not to respond immediately to either this salvage company or the Naval Historical Division. Instead, she focused on accelerating her partnership with the Maritime Historical Society, which offered the most balanced approach to the competing values at stake: historical preservation, academic access, financial consideration, and respect for her property rights. 2 days later, she met with Dr. Hayes and the Society's legal counsel, Jason Reed, to formalize their collaboration agreement. Jason was in his mid-50s, a former naval officer himself who had transitioned to maritime law after his service. I served 20 years in the Navy before law school, he explained as they reviewed the draft agreement, including time with the Judge Advocate General's Corps. That experience helps me navigate the complex jurisdictional issues between private ownership and military interests. The contract they proposed recognized Margaret's ownership of both the Lighthouse property and all materials discovered within it, with the Society providing conservation services, academic expertise, and institutional support in exchange for research access and potential exhibition rights for select materials. Most importantly, the agreement included provisions for handling any financial opportunities arising from the discovery, including potential shipwreck salvage operations. The Society would help facilitate appropriate partnerships while ensuring Margaret retained significant rights as the discoverer of the location information. This framework protects your interests while leveraging our institutional capabilities, Jason explained. We've handled similar situations involving private historical discoveries with commercial potential. Margaret reviewed the document carefully before signing. What about the Naval Historical Division's interest? How do we address their potential claims? The agreement includes provisions for government consultation, Jason pointed out, indicating specific sections. We acknowledge sovereign immunity over military vessels while establishing your discovery rights for location information in any privately owned cargo. The Society has established protocols for these negotiations. With the agreement signed, they implemented the first phase immediately comprehensive documentation of the archive's contents by the Society's preservation specialists. A team arrived at the lighthouse the following day, professionally photographing and cataloging every document, map, and artifact in Admiral Caldwell's hidden room. As the documentation proceeded, Dr. Hayes made an important discovery. Among the journals was a detailed explanation of Admiral Caldwell's classification system for the shipwrecks he had tracked. He had categorized them into three groups: military vessels under naval jurisdiction, civilian vessels carrying military cargo under contract, and civilian vessels carrying private commercial goods. This distinction was crucial for navigating the complex legal landscape of salvage rights. Military vessels remained under government jurisdiction regardless of time elapsed. Civilian vessels with military cargo occupied a gray area with potential for negotiated rights. Civilian vessels with commercial cargo offered the clearest path to traditional salvage claims. Of the 23 shipwrecks in Caldwell's records, 7 were military vessels, 9 were civilian ships with military cargo, and 7 were purely commercial vessels. Several of these commercial vessels carried particularly valuable cargo, including the industrial diamonds on the William Bradford and art treasures aboard the Northern Light. This categorization provided a strategic approach to the potential value of Caldwell's information. By focusing initially on the commercial vessels, they could establish salvage operations without immediately confronting military jurisdictional challenges. With the documentation phase complete, the Society transported select materials to their conservation laboratory for preservation work. Margaret maintained the original archive intact at the lighthouse, now with improved security measures installed by specialists recommended by Jason. The formal partnership with the Maritime Historical Society had barely been established when the next development arrived: a registered letter from Captain Nathan Parker, Director of Historical Archives, Naval History and Heritage Command. Dear Miss Sullivan, the United States Navy has been informed of your discovery of documents and materials related to Rear Admiral Robert Caldwell's service during World War II. As these materials potentially contain information pertaining to naval operations and military vessels under continued United States sovereignty, we request a formal consultation at your earliest convenience. Please contact my office to arrange a meeting within the next 10 business days. This matter requires prompt attention to ensure proper handling of potentially sensitive historical materials. The tone was professional but carried clear institutional authority. Dr. Hayes reviewed the letter and offered her assessment. This is standard procedure when privately held documents might contain military information. The good news is they're approaching through formal channels rather than simply asserting jurisdiction. Margaret called the number provided and arranged a meeting at the Maritime Historical Society's offices rather than at the lighthouse itself. This neutral territory offered both symbolic and practical advantages, establishing her partnership with the Society as a mediating framework rather than dealing with the Navy directly. The day before the scheduled meeting with the Navy representatives, Thomas arrived at the lighthouse with disturbing news. Someone tried to access your property last night, he reported. Albert Hayes was driving past after a late fishing trip and saw flashlights moving around the keeper's quarters. When he called out, 2 figures ran back across the causeway to a waiting vehicle. Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen stove. Did he see who it was? Too dark to identify them, Thomas said, but he's certain they were attempting to enter the lighthouse. I've asked the county sheriff to increase patrols in the area, but with the tide schedule, it's impossible to maintain constant surveillance. The attempted intrusion raised the stakes considerably. Until now, interest in her discovery had remained within official or professional channels. This nighttime incursion suggested more clandestine motivations. Should I stay somewhere else? Margaret asked, suddenly feeling vulnerable in her isolated home. Thomas shook his head. Actually, I think you should have someone stay here with you. The lighthouse itself is quite defensible, single access point, solid stone walls, good visibility. But you shouldn't be alone until we understand who's taking such an interest in your discovery. I can't ask you to stay here, Margaret protested. Your house in town has been empty except for me since Eleanor passed. Thomas said, his voice softening at the mention of his late wife. And these old bones wouldn't be much use in a confrontation anyway. But I was thinking of Jason Reed. As a former naval officer, he has the training to handle any security concerns. Margaret considered this suggestion. Jason had impressed her with his professionalism and balanced approach to the complex issues surrounding her discovery. Having him on site would provide both security and legal expertise as the situation evolved. I'll call him, she decided. And in the meantime, we should secure the archive room more effectively. Together, they reinforced the hidden entrance to Admiral Caldwell's archive, adding a more substantial locking mechanism that couldn't be easily bypassed. Thomas also helped Margaret install motion sensor lights around the exterior of the lighthouse and a simple alarm system on the main entrance. As they worked, Margaret found herself reflecting on how drastically her circumstances had changed in just 2 weeks. From facing homelessness to becoming the custodian of historically significant materials that multiple parties now sought to access, some through legitimate channels, others through more questionable means. Do you regret buying this place? Thomas asked, seeming to read her thoughts as they tested the new security lights. Margaret gazed up at the lighthouse tower, now gilded by the setting sun. No, she said with surprising certainty. Despite all the complications, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Frank would say this lighthouse found me, not the other way around. Thomas smiled, the weathered lines of his face deepening. I think he'd be proud of how you're handling all this. Not everyone would approach such a discovery with your sense of responsibility. That evening, Jason arrived with a small duffel bag and a wealth of practical suggestions for improving lighthouse security. His military background was evident in his methodical assessment of potential vulnerabilities and strategic positioning of monitoring devices. The good news is that the causeway creates a natural choke point, he explained over dinner in Margaret's gradually improving kitchen. No one can approach without being visible, and at high tide access is completely cut off. The bad news is that once someone is across, there's limited escape routes if there's trouble. Do you really think there could be trouble? Margaret asked, the reality of her situation sinking in more deeply. Jason considered his response carefully. The value of what you've discovered extends beyond academic interest. The shipwreck locations alone could be worth millions to the right parties. And if there's classified material in Caldwell's records that certain people don't want exposed, that adds another layer of potential risk. His candid assessment was sobering but necessary. Margaret appreciated that he didn't sugarcoat the situation while also not unnecessarily alarming her. Tomorrow's meeting with the Navy representatives will give us a better sense of official interest, Jason continued. But someone else clearly knows about Caldwell's archive and wants access badly enough to risk trespassing. Until we identify all the players, we need to remain vigilant. The next morning, Margaret, accompanied by Thomas, Jason, and Dr. Hayes, arrived at the Maritime Historical Society for the scheduled meeting with the Navy representatives. Captain Nathan Parker arrived at the appointed time with a single colleague introduced as Dr. Evelyn Miller, the Navy's senior archivist for Atlantic operations. Both wore civilian clothes rather than uniforms, suggesting they were approaching this as an archival matter rather than a military assertion of authority. Thank you for meeting with us, Miss Sullivan, Captain Parker began after introductions. Admiral Caldwell's service to naval intelligence was significant, and any materials he maintained would be of considerable historical interest to our department. I appreciate the Navy's historical interest, Margaret replied carefully. As you know, I've established a formal partnership with the Maritime Historical Society to ensure these materials are properly preserved and documented. Dr. Miller nodded approvingly. The Society has an excellent reputation for conservation work. Our primary concern is identifying any materials that might contain classified operational information or specific tactical data that remain sensitive. This framing, focusing on potential classification concerns, rather than asserting ownership, suggested a more collaborative approach than Margaret had feared. Dr. Hayes presented the cataloging work already completed, highlighting the historical context of Caldwell's archives. The materials primarily document convoy protection strategies and anti-submarine tactics from 1942 to 1945, with post-war annotations through 1957, she explained. While historically significant preliminary review suggests these would fall under declassification protocols for World War II operations, Captain Parker reviewed the catalog with professional interest. Admiral Caldwell was known for his meticulous record-keeping. His tactical innovations saved countless lives during the Battle of the Atlantic. He paused, studying Margaret with measured assessment. "May I ask what you intend to do with these materials, Miss Sullivan?" The question represented the true purpose of this meeting, determining her intentions and establishing the Navy's position regarding them. "My primary goal is ensuring proper historical preservation," Margaret responded. "These materials document an important chapter in naval history that deserves scholarly attention and public understanding. The Society's expertise helps fulfill that responsibility." She deliberately omitted specific mention of the shipwreck information, waiting to see if the Navy representatives would raise the subject directly. Dr. Miller exchanged a glance with Captain Parker before addressing the unspoken issue. "Our records indicate Admiral Caldwell maintained detailed tracking of vessel losses during his command. These would have significant historical value for documenting the full impact of the Battle of the Atlantic." This careful phrasing confirmed the Navy was aware of the shipwreck documentation, but was approaching it as historical information rather than salvage intelligence, at least initially. "Admiral Caldwell's records do include vessel tracking information," Margaret acknowledged. "Dr. Hayes's team is assessing its historical significance and accuracy compared to official naval records." Captain Parker nodded thoughtfully. The Navy would be interested in reviewing those specific materials. Some vessel locations remain incompletely documented in our official archives, particularly those lost in deep water operations. The conversation continued with discussion of potential collaboration between the Maritime Historical Society and Naval Historical Division for academic research using Caldwell's archive. Throughout the meeting, Margaret noted that the Navy representatives were carefully establishing interest without making direct claims or assertions of authority, a more measured approach than their initial communications had suggested. As the meeting concluded, Captain Parker presented a formal request for access to the archive for qualified Navy historians, particularly focusing on the vessel tracking information. "We would propose a joint research initiative that respects your ownership of these materials while allowing our specialists to enhance our historical understanding of these operations." Margaret promised to consider the proposal in consultation with the Maritime Historical Society, maintaining her position of deliberate cooperation without immediate commitments. After the Navy representatives departed, Dr. Hayes offered her assessment. "They're primarily interested in the shipwreck locations, but approaching cautiously through historical channels rather than asserting jurisdiction. That's actually a positive development. It suggests room for negotiation rather than confrontation." "What's our best approach?" Margaret asked. "Strategic transparency," Jason advised. "We acknowledge the vessel information exists and propose a research partnership that includes the Navy while maintaining your discovery rights. Their historical interest is legitimate, and including them appropriately strengthens your position regarding any future salvage operations." This balanced approach aligned with Margaret's instincts. Creating adversarial relationships with government agencies would only complicate her situation, while thoughtful collaboration could help navigate the complex jurisdictional challenges surrounding shipwreck recovery. As they left the meeting, Dr. Hayes mentioned another development. "I've been contacted by Lawrence Graham, the tech billionaire who founded GlobalNet. Apparently, he's a significant donor to maritime history causes and has expressed interest in supporting the Caldwell Archive preservation." "Why would a tech billionaire care about World War II naval records?" Thomas asked skeptically. "He collects historical artifacts," Dr. Hayes explained, "particularly those related to technological innovation. His family has maritime connections as well. His grandfather served in the Merchant Marine during the war." Margaret mentally added another player to the increasingly complex situation surrounding her discovery. The Navy, the Historical Society, a commercial salvage company, and now a billionaire collector, each with their own interests in Admiral Caldwell's archive. Back at the Lighthouse that evening, Margaret sat with Thomas and Jason at her small kitchen table, reviewing the day's developments and planning their next steps. The wind had picked up, sending waves crashing against the rocky shore below and making the old lighthouse creak and groan. I think we're establishing a good framework, Jason said, reviewing their notes from the meeting with the Navy. The Historical Society provides academic legitimacy, while the Navy partnership addresses the military vessel jurisdiction. If we can secure funding from Lawrence Graham for the preservation efforts, that creates a sustainable model. What about Triton Salvage? Margaret asked. They've sent 2 more emails since yesterday. They're the most straightforward of the interested parties, Jason acknowledged. They want the shipwreck locations for commercial recovery operations. The question is whether they're the ones who attempted to access the lighthouse, or if there's another player we haven't identified yet. I still don't understand how word spreads so quickly, Margaret said, troubled by the rapid escalation of interest in her discovery. I only found the archive a week ago, and I've only shared the information with you, Dr. Hayes, and now the Navy representatives. Thomas frowned, his judicial mind examining the timeline. Someone knew what was in that lighthouse before you bought it. The question is why they didn't acquire it themselves. The county auction required public access if a government entity purchased it, Margaret recalled. Dr. Hayes mentioned the Navy had inquired about buying it in the 1980s. A public lighthouse would make a poor secret archive, Jason observed. They may have been waiting for a private buyer they could approach or pressure after the sale. They just didn't expect you to discover the archive so quickly or to take such a principled approach to its contents. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching, unexpected at this hour with the tide rising. Jason moved to the window, his military training evident in his careful positioning to observe without being visible. Black SUV, government plates, he reported. 2 men approaching the causeway. They'll have to wait for the tide if they want to cross. Margaret joined him at the window. Through the gathering darkness, she could see headlights illuminating the beginning of the causeway, now partially submerged by the rising tide. The figures of 2 men stood at the water's edge, apparently debating whether to attempt the crossing. Navy, she asked. Possibly, Jason replied, or another agency entirely. Government vehicles all use the same plate series. They watched as the men returned to their vehicle after several minutes, apparently deciding against risking the crossing. The SUV remained parked at the mainland end of the causeway, its occupants presumably waiting for the tide to recede. We should use this opportunity, Thomas suggested. The tide won't be low enough for crossing until morning. That gives us time to secure anything particularly sensitive. Margaret nodded, moving toward the hidden panel that concealed the entrance to Caldwell's archive. There's something we haven't fully examined yet, the wooden chest with the brass lock. We managed to open it briefly, but I haven't had time to properly go through the contents. Together they descended to the archive room and focused their attention on the wooden chest. Inside, beneath the journals and personal effects they had already discovered, they found a sealed metal container. Using tools from Robert's repair kit, they carefully opened it to reveal a collection of microfilm reels and a small brass key with a numbered tag. Backup copies, Jason confirmed, examining the microfilm. Standard procedure for intelligence operations: never keep all your documentation in one location. But where's the second location, Margaret wondered, turning the small brass key over in her hand. The tag attached to it bore only a number 7C. Thomas examined the key thoughtfully. It could be a safe deposit box, though most banks would have changed their locks over the decades, or another secure location entirely. As they continued examining the chest's contents, Margaret discovered a folded paper tucked into the lining of the lid, a map of the lighthouse and surrounding coastline, with a small X marked in what appeared to be an underwater cave about half a mile offshore. Could this be the secondary location, she asked, showing the others? Jason studied the map with professional interest. It's possible. Naval intelligence often used underwater caches during the war, waterproof containers secured in natural formations. It's a technique that goes back centuries. But how would we access an underwater cave? Thomas asked practically. None of us are trained divers, and that coastline is treacherous even in good weather. We wouldn't need to, Jason replied. If this is indeed a secondary cache location, Caldwell would have needed a way to access it regularly. There might be another passage from the lighthouse itself. This possibility sent them searching the archive room more carefully, looking for any indication of another hidden entrance. After 20 minutes of methodical examination, Margaret noticed something unusual about the stone flooring beneath the map table, a slight difference in the mortar pattern forming a rough circle about 3 feet in diameter. "Look at this," she called to the others, kneeling to examine the stones more closely. The pattern is different here, as if this section was added later. Thomas and Jason joined her, and together they moved the heavy map table aside. The circular pattern in the stone floor was now clearly visible, with what appeared to be a recessed metal ring near one edge. "A trap door," Thomas suggested. Jason nodded, producing a small flashlight from his pocket and examining the edges of the circle. And fairly sophisticated for its time. The stones are set on a pivot mechanism. That metal ring would be the lifting point. With careful coordination, they managed to raise the circular stone section, revealing a narrow vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the wall descending into darkness. A cool, damp breeze carried the unmistakable scent of the ocean. "This must connect to a sea cave," Jason said, shining his light down the shaft. "Probably accessible only at low tide. A perfect, secure storage location, invisible from above, inaccessible from the sea, except under specific conditions." "Should we explore it?" Margaret asked, peering into the darkness. "Not tonight," Jason advised firmly. "We don't know the condition of those rungs, the distance to the bottom, or the tide schedule for the cave system. We need proper equipment and planning before attempting any descent." Thomas agreed. "And we need to secure this archive first. If those men outside are here for Caldwell's records, we should focus on protecting what we've already discovered before exploring further." Reluctantly, Margaret helped them lower the stone trap door back into place and reposition the map table. The discovery of this potential secondary archive added yet another layer to the mystery of Admiral Caldwell's legacy and raised new questions about what additional secrets might lie beneath her lighthouse. As they climbed the stairs back to the main level, Jason paused suddenly, raising a hand for silence. Through the old stone walls came the distant sound of a boat engine, a deep, muffled rumble, approaching from the seaward side of the lighthouse. "Someone's coming by water," he said quietly, "probably to avoid being seen from the mainland road." They quickly extinguished the lights in the keeper's quarters and moved to the ocean-facing windows. In the darkness, they could make out the running lights of a small boat approaching the rocky shoreline below the lighthouse. "This isn't a casual nighttime fishing expedition," Thomas observed grimly. "No," Jason agreed, his voice hardening. "This is a deliberate approach under cover of darkness. They're timing their arrival with the visitors in the SUV as a distraction." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. Her simple quest for affordable housing had led her into a situation with stakes she had never anticipated, one that now appeared to involve clandestine operations and competing interests willing to trespass on her property in pursuit of Admiral Caldwell's secrets. "What do we do?" she asked, watching as the boat cut its engine and drifted toward the rocky shore below. Jason's response was calm but decisive. "We defend your property, document the intrusion, and demonstrate that this lighthouse and its contents are securely protected." He turned to Thomas. "Call the sheriff. Report suspicious activity. Make it clear this is a potential breaking and entering, not just trespassers." As Thomas made the call, Jason handed Margaret a digital camera from his bag. "Record everything you can see without exposing yourself at the windows. We need documentation of who's attempting to access your property." The small boat had now reached the shoreline, and 3 figures were disembarking carrying what appeared to be equipment cases. They began making their way up the rocky path toward the lighthouse, their movements purposeful and coordinated. "Professional," Jason murmured, watching their approach. "Not opportunistic thieves or curious trespassers. They know exactly what they're doing and what they're here for." Thomas returned from making the call. "Sheriff's deputy is on the way, but it'll take at least 20 minutes for them to reach this location." "That's fine," Jason said. "We're not going to confront them directly, but we are going to let them know they've been seen." He moved to the lighthouse's ancient electrical panel, where Robert Hayes had restored limited power for essential lighting. With a few quick adjustments, he activated the exterior floodlights that once illuminated the lighthouse grounds for maintenance work. The sudden, brilliant illumination caught the approaching figures in the open, freezing them in place like actors on a suddenly lit stage. For a moment, no one moved, the intruders startled by the unexpected exposure, the lighthouse occupants watching intently from within. Then the 3 figures turned and ran, abandoning their equipment cases as they scrambled back down the rocky path toward their waiting boat. Margaret captured several clear images before they disappeared from view, the sound of their hastily restarted engine soon fading into the night. "Well, that was effective," Thomas observed dryly. "Simple but useful," Jason agreed. They now know the lighthouse is occupied and secured. More importantly, they know they've been seen and photographed. That changes their risk calculations significantly. Margaret reviewed the images on the camera's display. The quality was good enough to make out features of the intruders. Three men in dark clothing, professional-grade equipment, no obvious identifying markers. "Do you think they're connected to the Navy or Triton salvage?" she asked. Jason shook his head. Neither would approach this way. The Navy has official channels to request access, and legitimate salvage operations work through legal means. This is someone else, someone who knows about Caldwell's archive but doesn't want their interest officially documented. The question, Thomas added, is how many different parties know about what's hidden here, and how far are they willing to go to access it? The implications of that question hung in the air as they waited for the sheriff's deputy to arrive. Margaret looked around at the stone walls of her lighthouse home, now transformed from a sanctuary into something more complex, a fortress protecting historical secrets, a target for unknown interests in the center of a web of competing claims and hidden agendas. What had begun as a desperate bid for affordable housing had evolved into a responsibility she had never anticipated, placing her at the intersection of history, naval intelligence, and potentially valuable shipwreck locations. The widow who had spent her last $278 on an abandoned lighthouse now stood as the guardian of Admiral Caldwell's legacy, facing challenges that went far beyond simply restoring an historic structure. As the deputy's vehicle lights appeared on the distant mainland road, Margaret made a decision. She would not be intimidated into abandoning her home or surrendering Caldwell's archive to any single interested party. She would honor the Admiral's intention to preserve this information until it could be properly utilized, navigating the complex legal and ethical considerations with the same careful determination that had characterized her approach to life since Frank's death. The lighthouse had found her for a reason. Now she would prove worthy of its trust. The sheriff's deputy arrived 30 minutes later, surveying the abandoned equipment cases with professional thoroughness. Deputy Sarah Collins was in her mid-40s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent her life in coastal Maine and the alert eyes of a law enforcement officer who had seen everything the small county had to offer. "Not your average lighthouse trespassers," she observed, examining the high-end waterproof cases left behind in the intruder's hasty retreat. "These are professional-grade diving and survey tools." "Treasure hunters," Margaret suggested. "Maybe," Collins replied, though her tone suggested doubt. "But most treasure hunters don't use military-grade waterproof comms." She held up a sophisticated radio unit. "This isn't something you pick up at the local marine supply store." Jason examined the equipment with knowing eyes. "These are similar to what we used in naval special operations, designed for covert underwater reconnaissance." Which raises the question, Thomas said, of what they expected to find underwater near this lighthouse. Margaret thought of the trap door they had discovered in the archive room floor, with its shaft leading down toward what appeared to be a sea cave. The map, with its marked underwater location, suddenly seemed even more significant. "I'll file a report," Deputy Collins said, photographing the equipment, "and increase patrols in this area for the next few weeks. But you should know our department's resources are limited. This lighthouse is isolated, especially at high tide." "We understand," Margaret assured her. "We've already implemented security measures." After the deputy departed with the confiscated equipment, Jason, Thomas, and Margaret returned to the kitchen to assess their situation. The black SUV had disappeared from the mainland end of the causeway, its occupants presumably warned off by the patrol car's arrival. "Those weren't opportunistic trespassers," Jason said firmly. "They came prepared for underwater exploration with military-grade equipment. They know, or at least suspect, that there's something hidden beneath this lighthouse." "Could the Navy have sent them?" Margaret asked. "Captain Parker seemed reasonable in our meeting, but perhaps they have a more aggressive approach running in parallel." Jason shook his head. "The Navy wouldn't need to sneak around at night. They have legal channels to request access to materials that might contain classified information. This was someone else, someone without official standing, but with resources and motivation." "The question is, how many different parties know about Caldwell's archive?" Thomas mused. "And what exactly are they looking for?" Margaret glanced toward the hidden panel concealing the archive entrance. "I think we need to thoroughly examine everything in that room before making any further decisions. There may be information we've overlooked that could explain the level of interest we're seeing." They spent the remainder of the night methodically reviewing Admiral Caldwell's materials, paying particular attention to documents they hadn't previously examined in detail. In a folder labeled Project Aurora, they discovered references to an experimental underwater detection system developed in the final years of World War II. "Listen to this," Margaret said, reading from one of Caldwell's journal entries dated November 1944. "Project Aurora shows promising results in trials off the New England coast. The ability to detect submerged vessels through electromagnetic field variations could revolutionize anti-submarine warfare. If fully deployed before the Germans developed countermeasures, it could turn the tide in the Atlantic." Electromagnetic detection in 1944. Jason's eyebrows rose in surprise. That technology wasn't officially developed until decades later. According to this, Margaret continued scanning the documents, Caldwell was overseeing a black project to developing prototype detection systems. They had a breakthrough in late 1940 but faced resistance from the traditional naval command structures. "The military's eternal conflict," Jason commented. "Innovative officers pushing new technologies versus the institutional resistance to change." As Margaret continued reading, her expression grew more troubled. Caldwell reports that one of the prototype devices was lost when the USS Galloway was sunk by a German U-boat in January 1945. He seems particularly concerned about the Germans recovering the technology. "The USS Galloway," Thomas repeated. "Is that one of the shipwreck locations marked in his records?" Margaret checked the master list of vessels. "Yes, it's one of the military vessels. Location marked with high precision depth, approximately 720 feet. Caldwell has it flagged as Priority Alpha, Technical Recovery Essential." "That explains the Navy's interest," Jason said. "If there was classified technology on that vessel, they'd want to ensure it remains secured even after all these years." "But it doesn't explain the nighttime visitors," Thomas pointed out. "Who else would know about this technology or care about it 78 years later?" They continued their examination, finding another intriguing reference in Caldwell's later journals. In an entry from 1956, he wrote, "Met with LG today regarding Aurora recovery options. His resources could make the operation possible, but I remain concerned about private interests controlling military technology, even obsolete systems. The principle of the technology remains sound even if our implementation was primitive." "LG," Margaret repeated. "Could that be Lawrence Graham's father or grandfather?" "Lawrence Graham is in his 60s now," Jason calculated. "His father could have been an influential figure in the 1950s with the resources to mount deep-sea recovery operations, which would explain why Lawrence Graham, the tech billionaire, suddenly has an interest in supporting the preservation of Caldwell's archive," Thomas added. "It's not about historical preservation, it's about family history and possibly technological recovery." This revelation cast a new light on the competing interests surrounding Caldwell's archive. Not just historical documentation or valuable cargo, but potentially groundbreaking technology that had been classified and then lost to history, or so the Navy had thought. "We need to proceed carefully," Margaret decided. "Tomorrow I'll contact Dr. Hayes about our findings, but I want to hold back the specifics about Project Aurora until we understand the implications better." "Agreed," Jason said. "And I think we should explore that underwater passage sooner rather than later. If the intruders return with reinforcements, we need to know what's down there." The following morning, after a few hours of fitful sleep, they prepared to explore the underwater passage. Jason had brought basic diving equipment in his truck. Nothing elaborate, but enough for a preliminary examination of the shaft and whatever it might lead to. "The tide is at its lowest point," he reported, checking the charts. "If this passage does connect to a sea cave, as we suspect, this would be the optimal time for exploration." They returned to the archive room and once again moved the map table aside to reveal the circular stone trapdoor. With careful coordination, they raised it, revealing the narrow vertical shaft with its metal rungs descending into darkness. "I'll go first," Jason said, securing a waterproof light to his belt and testing the first few rungs for stability. The metal shows some corrosion but seems structurally sound. These were built to last. Margaret and Thomas watched anxiously as Jason descended the shaft, the beam of his light gradually diminishing as he climbed down. After what seemed an eternity, his voice echoed up from below. "I've reached the bottom. It's a small chamber carved into the rock with another passage leading seaward. The floor is wet, but not submerged. I'm going to follow the passage." Several tense minutes passed before they heard from him again. Found something. There's a small cave here with a waterproof cabinet built into the rock wall. It's secured with a numbered lock. I think your brass key might fit this. Margaret carefully descended the metal rungs, finding them slippery but sound. At the bottom of the shaft, she found herself in a low-ceilinged chamber hewn from the living rock beneath the lighthouse. A narrow passage barely wide enough for a person to walk through extended toward the sea. Following it, she emerged into a larger cave where Jason waited beside a metal cabinet embedded in the rock wall. The cabinet was approximately 3 feet square, constructed of what appeared to be stainless steel, with a brass lock bearing the number 7C, matching the tag on the key they had found. This has to be Caldwell's secondary storage location, Margaret said, inserting the key into the lock. It turned smoothly despite decades of disuse, the mechanism evidently protected from the corrosive sea air. Inside the cabinet, they found a watertight metal case containing duplicates of many documents from the main archive, along with several items not present above technical schematics for what appeared to be the Project Aurora detection system, photographs of prototype equipment, and a small journal with Caldwell's personal notes on the project's potential applications beyond military use. He was thinking decades ahead. Margaret marveled, carefully examining the journal. He speculates here about electromagnetic field technology being used for everything from medicine to communications to energy generation. Some of these ideas sound like concepts that weren't developed until the 1980s or later. No wonder multiple parties are interested, Jason said. This isn't just historical documentation, it's potential intellectual property with modern applications. They carefully secured the materials in waterproof bags Jason had brought and made their way back up the shaft to the archive room where Thomas waited anxiously. We need to document these immediately, Margaret decided, but we'll keep them separate from the main archive for now until we understand the full implications. I want to control who knows about this secondary discovery. As they examined the new materials, a particular notation in Caldwell's journal caught Margaret's attention. In an entry from 1957, he wrote, "Should circumstances require activation of secondary protocols, contact operations through established channel. Recognition code, Compass Rose 47 Baker 9. Family connections remain secure through LG line." Another reference to LG, Thomas noted, in some kind of code phrase for communication. It sounds like Caldwell established a contingency plan, Jason observed, a way to activate some kind of response if the archive was discovered or threatened. Margaret's phone rang before she could respond. It was Dr. Hayes from the Maritime Historical Society. "Miss Sullivan, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday evening. There's been a development you should know about. Lawrence Graham has requested a meeting with all parties involved in the Caldwell archive. He's offering substantial funding for preservation and research, but he wants immediate access to the complete materials." "That's quite a coincidence," Margaret replied carefully. "We've just been discussing Mr. Graham's potential connection to the archive." "Connection?" Hayes sounded surprised. "What kind of connection?" "We've found references in Caldwell's journals to someone with the initials LG, who was involved in discussions about recovering certain materials from shipwrecks as early as the 1950s. We believe it might have been Lawrence Graham's father or grandfather." A long pause followed. "That would explain his specific interest, Doctor," Hayes finally said. "I assumed it was just part of his general support for maritime history. This adds a personal dimension I wasn't aware of." "When is this meeting supposed to take place?" Margaret asked. "He suggested tomorrow morning at the Society's headquarters. Captain Parker from the Navy has already agreed to attend, as has Maxwell Prescott from Triton Salvage." The rapid convergence of all interested parties sent a warning signal through Margaret's mind. "That seems unusually hasty. Why the sudden urgency?" "Graham indicated he has a limited window in his schedule before returning to California," Dr. Hayes explained, "and he's offering a substantial grant, several $1 million for preservation and research." After ending the call, Margaret shared the development with Thomas and Jason. "I don't like this," Thomas said bluntly. "Too many coincidental timelines. First the Navy contacts you, then Triton Salvage, then Graham appears with millions to offer. And meanwhile, someone tries to break in using military-grade equipment. Someone is coordinating these approaches." "Or they're all reacting to the same trigger," Jason suggested. Perhaps word of your purchase reached someone who knew about Caldwell's archive, and now all the interested parties are scrambling to secure access before their competitors. Either way, Margaret decided, we need to be extremely careful about tomorrow's meeting. I won't bring any original materials, and I won't disclose what we've found in the underwater cabinet. The night passed without further intrusion attempts, though none of them slept well. In the morning, they prepared for the meeting with methodical care, selecting photographs and catalog information to share while keeping the most sensitive discoveries private. Remember, Thomas advised as they drove toward Portland, you hold the legal ownership of everything found on your property. Don't let impressive titles or financial offers pressure you into hasty decisions. The Maritime Historical Society's conference room had been prepared for a formal meeting with name placards indicating assigned seating around a polished oak table. Dr. Hayes greeted them at the door, her professional demeanor slightly strained. Mr. Graham arrived early with his legal team, she murmured to Margaret. They've been reviewing our standard research access agreements and suggesting modifications. Inside, Lawrence Graham rose to greet them. In his mid-60s, he had the trim build of someone who prioritized fitness, silver haircut in an expensive style, and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. His handshake was firm but brief. Miss Sullivan, a pleasure to meet the lighthouse keeper who's uncovered such a significant historical treasure, he said, his West Coast accent contrasting with the New England tones dominant in the room. Your discovery could reshape our understanding of naval intelligence operations during a critical period in American history. Captain Parker from the Naval Historical Division nodded politely from his place at the table, while Maxwell Prescott of Triton Salvage, a weathered man in his 50s with the perpetual tan of someone who spent his life on the water, studied Margaret with open curiosity. As they took their seats, Graham opened the meeting with a directness that bordered on impatience. I appreciate everyone making time for this discussion on short notice. As you all know, I've proposed establishing the Caldwell Maritime Research Initiative with substantial funding for preservation, academic research, and potential recovery operations related to the materials discovered at Cape Unity Lighthouse. He gestured to one of his assistants, who distributed bound proposals to everyone at the table. The initiative would provide $5 million in initial funding, with additional resources allocated for specific recovery operations as approved by the Oversight Committee. Margaret scanned the document, immediately noting the proposed governance structure. A 5-person oversight committee with Graham holding 2 votes and the remaining 3 divided between the Historical Society, the Navy, and Margaret herself. You're proposing majority control of decision-making, she observed quietly. Graham smiled thinly. I'm proposing efficient governance with appropriate representation for all stakeholders. My financial commitment justifies a proportional voice in how resources are allocated. Before we discuss governance, Margaret replied, I'd like to understand everyone's specific interest in Admiral Caldwell's archive. The historical significance is clear, but each of you seems to have particular priorities. A moment of silence followed as the representatives exchanged glances, each seemingly reluctant to be the first to reveal their true motivations. Captain Parker eventually spoke. The Navy's interest is primarily historical, with secondary concern for any still classified materials that might be present. Admiral Caldwell's tactical innovations saved countless lives during the Battle of the Atlantic, and his complete records would significantly enhance our historical understanding of that conflict. And the shipwreck locations, Margaret pressed, particularly the USS Galloway. Parker's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Any military vessel remains under Navy jurisdiction, regardless of time elapsed. The Galloway is of particular historical interest due to the circumstances of its loss. And Project Aurora, Margaret asked, directly watching for reactions. The effect was immediate. Parker's professional composure faltered momentarily, while Graham leaned forward with sudden intensity. Prescott from Triton Salvage looked confused, glancing between them, as if missing a critical piece of information. Project Aurora was classified at the highest levels, Parker said carefully. If Caldwell's archive contains documentation related to that program, it would be subject to continued security protocols. My understanding, Graham interjected smoothly, is that the Aurora program was officially decommissioned in 1960 with all materials either destroyed or permanently archived. Any surviving documentation would have significant historical value, but limited practical application given subsequent technological developments. His casual knowledge of a supposedly classified program confirmed Margaret's suspicions about his family's connection to Caldwell's work. My father, Graham continued, seeming to make a calculated decision for transparency, worked with Admiral Caldwell on several projects during and after the war. Their correspondence suggested the Admiral maintained personal records that might illuminate some of their collaborative efforts. My interest is partly historical, partly personal, understanding my father's legacy. And Triton Salvage's interest. Margaret turned to Prescott, who had remained silent during this exchange. Straightforward commercial opportunity, Prescott replied without apology. If Caldwell's records contain accurate locations for vessels with recoverable cargo, particularly the civilian merchant ships, that information has significant value to our operations. We're prepared to negotiate appropriate finder's fees and partnership terms for any successful recovery efforts. Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. The Historical Society's priority remains preservation and academic access. The potential financial aspects are secondary to ensuring these materials are properly conserved and made available to qualified researchers. Margaret nodded, gathering her thoughts before responding. In the brief silence, she noticed Graham checking his watch with subtle impatience. I appreciate everyone's candor, she began. Admiral Caldwell preserved these materials for a purpose to ensure that the complete historical record would be available when appropriate, not just the sanitized official version. I believe honoring that intention requires balanced consideration of all aspects: historical preservation, academic research, appropriate classification of genuinely sensitive materials, and yes, potential recovery of lost vessels and cargo. She closed the proposal document and placed it deliberately on the table. But I'm not prepared to surrender control of that process to any single interest, regardless of the financial incentives offered. Graham's expression hardened slightly. Miss Sullivan, with all due respect, maintaining and properly utilizing these materials requires resources far beyond what a retired schoolteacher can provide. My proposal offers the most efficient path to achieving all the objectives you've just outlined. Perhaps, Margaret acknowledged, but efficiency isn't my only concern. Balance and appropriate oversight are equally important. She turned to Hayes. The Historical Society's existing agreement provides a framework that respects all legitimate interests while maintaining my fundamental rights as the property owner. I believe we should build on that foundation rather than replacing it. Before Graham could respond, the conference room door opened and a society staff member entered with an urgent message for Dr. Hayes. After a brief, whispered conversation, the historian's expression grew alarmed. I've just been informed there's a situation at Cape Unity Lighthouse, she announced. Apparently, several individuals have been observed approaching the property by boat, and the local sheriff's department has responded to reports of a possible break-in. Margaret felt a cold knot form in her stomach. With her Thomas and Jason all at this meeting, the lighthouse was unattended. Perfect timing for someone determined to access the archive without interference. We need to go immediately, she said, rising from her chair. I'll come with you, Jason offered immediately. As will I, Captain Parker added, his professional demeanor shifting to one of command. If naval materials are at risk, I have a responsibility to assist. Graham's voice cut through the sudden tension. This is precisely why immediate action is necessary. Miss Sullivan, I can have a private security team at your lighthouse within the hour if you'll simply sign the preliminary agreement. Full protection for the archive and the property. The implied connection between the meeting's timing and the lighthouse intrusion wasn't lost on Margaret. Either this was an extraordinary coincidence or someone had orchestrated events to pressure her into a hasty decision. Thank you, Mr. Graham, but I'll handle this situation first and make decisions about partnerships afterward, she replied firmly. Dr. Hayes will reschedule our discussion once the lighthouse is secure. The drive back to Seaport Harbor passed in tense silence, Margaret's mind racing with possibilities and implications. Had Graham arranged the break-in to pressure her? Was the Navy conducting a covert operation in parallel with their official approach? Or was there another player, entirely someone who knew about Project Aurora and its potential value? As they approached the coastal road leading to the lighthouse, they could see emergency vehicle lights flashing at the mainland end of the causeway. Deputy Collins stood beside her patrol car, speaking into her radio. A Coast Guard vessel was visible offshore, apparently intercepting a small boat attempting to leave the area. "What's happening?" Margaret asked as they pulled alongside the patrol car. "We responded to a call from a local fisherman who spotted suspicious activity around the lighthouse," Collins explained. "Three individuals in diving gear were observed entering the water near the base of the lighthouse. When our patrol arrived, they attempted to flee by boat, but the Coast Guard was already in the area conducting exercises and responded to our alert." "Have they been apprehended?" Jason asked. Collins nodded. "The Coast Guard has them in custody. Initial identification suggests they're employees of a private maritime security firm based in Virginia. They've refused to state who hired them or what they were looking for." "The lighthouse itself, has it been breached?" Margaret asked anxiously. "No sign of entry to the main structure," Collins assured her. "Whatever they were after, they were focusing on the underwater approach." Margaret exchanged meaningful glances with Thomas and Jason. The underwater passage to Caldwell's secondary storage location was what the intruders had been targeting, which meant someone knew about its existence with considerable specificity. "I'd like to check the lighthouse immediately," Margaret said. "The tide is low enough to cross now." "I'll accompany you," Collins offered. "We should document any disturbance as potential evidence." As they crossed the causeway, Captain Parker fell into step beside Margaret. "Miss Sullivan, I feel I should inform you that the Navy had no involvement in this incident. Whatever these individuals were attempting, they were not operating under our authority." "I appreciate your clarification, Captain," Margaret replied, studying his expression for any sign of deception. His concern appeared genuine, which suggested either remarkable acting skills or actual surprise at the intrusion. The lighthouse exterior showed no signs of forced entry, but as they made their way to the kitchen and the hidden panel concealing the archive entrance, Margaret noticed subtle indications that someone had been searching for access points: a slightly misaligned cabinet, a rug not quite where she had left it. "Someone was looking for the entrance," she said quietly to Thomas, "but I don't think they found it." They descended to the archive room, finding it undisturbed. The map table remained positioned over the trapdoor leading to the underwater passage with no indication that anyone had discovered its existence. "Let's check the underwater cabinet," Jason suggested. "That seems to have been their target." With Collins and Parker observing, they moved the table and opened the trapdoor. Jason descended first, returning several minutes later with a troubled expression. "The cabinet has been tampered with," he reported. "The lock is damaged, though they didn't manage to open it. There are fresh tool marks around the doorframe. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it." This confirmation sent a chill through Margaret. The underwater passage had been Caldwell's most closely guarded secret, mentioned nowhere in the main archive materials. Only someone with inside knowledge, someone connected to Caldwell himself, would know of its existence. "Graham," Thomas said quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. "His father worked with Caldwell. He might have known about the secondary storage location. But why send people to break in when he's simultaneously offering millions for legal access?" Margaret wondered. "Because he doesn't want everything in the archive," Jason suggested. "Just specific materials related to Project Aurora. If he could extract those discreetly while negotiations were ongoing for the main archive, he'd control the most valuable intellectual property without anyone knowing it existed." Deputy Collins, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing concern, interjected. "I think you folks need to explain exactly what these intruders were after. If we're dealing with something beyond simple trespassing or attempted theft, I need to know what resources to request." Margaret hesitated, weighing her obligations. Finally, she nodded. "Admiral Caldwell preserved technical documentation related to an experimental detection system developed during World War II. The technology was classified at the time, and apparently some people believe it still has value today." Captain Parker's expression had grown increasingly grave. Project Aurora was decades ahead of its time. Caldwell's team was developing electromagnetic detection systems that wouldn't be successfully implemented until the 1980s. If his original technical documentation survived, he trailed off, the implications clear. "That's why Graham is so interested," Margaret concluded. "What for historical preservation or even family legacy, but for the potential intellectual property. Modern applications of Caldwell's theoretical work could be worth billions in today's technology markets." The immediate security crisis resolved, they gathered in the lighthouse kitchen to assess their situation. Deputy Collins had departed after taking detailed statements, promising increased patrols in coordination with the Coast Guard. Captain Parker remained his official demeanor, giving way to more candid conversation. The Navy would prefer that any Aurora documentation be turned over to the appropriate historical archives, he said, not for classification purposes. At this point, the technology has been independently developed and surpassed, but to ensure proper historical attribution and prevent private exploitation of what was fundamentally a public investment. Yet Lawrence Graham clearly believes he has some claim to this material through his father's collaboration with Caldwell, Thomas observed. Collaboration is a generous term, Parker replied. Leonard Graham was a wealthy industrialist who provided private funding for some of Caldwell's post-war research when the Navy scaled back certain programs. He was an investor, not a co-developer. And this new information helped complete the picture. Lawrence Graham wasn't pursuing his father's intellectual legacy. He was attempting to secure potentially valuable technological documentation that his father had helped finance but never owned. What would Admiral Caldwell want? Margaret asked quietly, returning to the fundamental question that had guided her approach from the beginning. He preserved these materials for a purpose. He could have destroyed them, or turned everything over to the Navy, or left them to Leonard Graham. Instead, he created this elaborate archive with its secondary secure storage. He wanted the truth preserved, Thomas said simply. Both the historical reality of naval operations during the war and the technical innovations that bureaucracy might have otherwise buried. He wanted future generations to have access to the complete record, not just the officially sanctioned version. Margaret nodded slowly, a decision forming in her mind. Then that's what we should ensure happens. Not controlled by any single interest, not the Navy, not the Historical Society, not Graham's money, and not my ownership rights. A balanced approach that honors all legitimate aspects while preventing exploitation. Over the next 2 days, Margaret worked with Thomas Jason and Dr. Hayes to develop a comprehensive proposal for managing the Caldwell archive. They documented the entire collection, including the materials from the underwater cabinet, creating a complete catalog of the historical, technical, and navigational information preserved by the Admiral. With this inventory as foundation, they drafted a governance structure for what they called the Caldwell Maritime Heritage Initiative, a collaborative entity that would balance historical preservation, academic research, appropriate security for sensitive materials, and manage recovery operations for the shipwreck locations. The proposed oversight committee would include representatives from the Maritime Historical Society, the Naval Historical Division, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and Margaret herself as the property owner, with equal voting rights and transparent decision-making processes. When the proposal was complete, Margaret convened a meeting at the Lighthouse itself, inviting all the interested parties to see firsthand the archive Caldwell had so carefully preserved. Dr. Hayes and Captain Parker accepted immediately. Maxwell Prescott from Triton Salvage agreed to attend with his company's legal counsel. Lawrence Graham initially declined, then reconsidered when informed that the complete Aurora documentation would be addressed in the discussion. The mid-November morning dawned clear and cold, the Atlantic waves crashing against the rocky shore below Cape Unity Lighthouse, with winter's approaching force. Margaret had prepared the keeper's quarters to accommodate the meeting. The main room now furnished with a proper conference table and chairs donated by the Historical Society. As the representatives arrived crossing the causeway at low tide, Margaret felt a sense of culmination, the isolated lighthouse she had purchased out of desperate necessity, now serving as the gathering point for a historically significant decision. Dr. Hayes arrived first, followed shortly by Captain Parker. Prescott and his legal counsel made the crossing together, their expressions suggesting skepticism tinged with curiosity. Lawrence Graham was the last to arrive, accompanied by a single assistant rather than the legal team he had brought to the previous meeting. "Welcome to Cape Unity Lighthouse." Margaret greeted them, standing at the head of the conference table with Thomas and Jason flanking her like sentinels. "I appreciate everyone making the journey here. I thought it important that our discussions take place where Admiral Caldwell chose to preserve his legacy." She guided them through a brief tour of the keeper's quarters, showing the restoration work that had transformed the abandoned structure into a functional living space and research facility. Then, with deliberate ceremony, she revealed the hidden panel in the kitchen wall and led them down to the archive room. The effect on Graham was particularly notable. His carefully maintained expression of polite interest faltered at the sight of the map table, with its precisely annotated Atlantic charts and the filing cabinets containing Caldwell's meticulous records. This is more extensive than I had imagined. He admitted, his gaze lingering on the technical diagrams visible among the documents. Admiral Caldwell was thorough in his documentation, Margaret agreed, both the historical naval operations and the technical innovations his team developed, including Project Aurora. She had deliberately placed the Aurora schematics from the underwater cabinet on the map table, their distinctive technical drawings immediately recognizable to those familiar with the project. Graham moved towards them with barely concealed eagerness, but Margaret continued speaking. Before we examine specific materials, I'd like to present my proposal for managing this archive and its contents. She distributed copies of the Caldwell Maritime Heritage Initiative framework, allowing each representative time to review the detailed governance structure, funding model, and operational principles. You're proposing equal representation for all stakeholders. Graham observed, his tone suggesting he found the concept problematic, despite significantly unequal contributions to funding and expertise. I'm proposing balanced governance appropriate to a historical legacy that has multiple dimensions, Margaret corrected gently. Financial resources are essential but not sufficient. Historical expertise, security considerations, and property rights all have legitimate standing in this situation. And what of private intellectual property interests? Graham pressed. My father invested considerably in Caldwell's research after the Navy reduced funding. Those investments created certain expectations regarding technological applications. Captain Parker intervened with cool precision. Mr. Graham, the Navy's records indicate that your father's financial support was documented as philanthropic contribution to post-war research, not as investment with expected return. Admiral Caldwell maintained complete control over the intellectual property, which technically remained under Navy jurisdiction even after declassification. Graham's expression hardened. There were understandings beyond the official documentation. Perhaps, Margaret acknowledged, but Admiral Caldwell's intentions seemed clear from his preservation efforts. He didn't leave these materials to your father or to private industry. He created an elaborate archive designed to protect them until they could be properly utilized for their historical significance, not just their commercial potential. The proposed recovery operations for the shipwreck locations would generate substantial revenue, Dr. Hayes pointed out, directing their attention to that section of the proposal, with proceeds appropriately shared among all contributing parties, including funding partners. Prescott, who had been studying the shipwreck coordinates with professional interest, nodded approvingly. The commercial value of the civilian vessel cargoes alone would fund the entire initiative for decades if properly managed, and Triton would welcome the opportunity to serve as operational partner for recovery efforts. The discussion continued for hours, moving from broad principles to specific provisions, as each representative advocated for their particular interests. Graham remained resistant to the equal governance model, but as the commercial potential of the recovery operations became clearer through Prescott's expert assessment, his opposition gradually softened. We could begin with the SS William Bradford, Prescott explained, pointing to the annotated map. The industrial diamonds alone would be worth millions at current market values, and the vessel's location and depth are well within our operational capabilities. And the cultural artifacts aboard the SS Northern Light, Dr. Hayes asked? Those have incalculable historical value but require specialized conservation. The recovery sequence would prioritize vessels based on multiple factors, Margaret explained. Historical significance, conservation requirements, and yes, potential financial return to fund ongoing operations. The Oversight Committee would ensure balanced consideration of all these aspects. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows through the lighthouse windows, the outline of a sustainable agreement began to emerge. The Caldwell Maritime Heritage Initiative would proceed with modified but still balanced governance, adequate funding through both grants and recovery operations, and appropriate protocols for handling the different categories of materials Caldwell had preserved. Even Graham eventually conceded the fundamental wisdom of the approach. My father always spoke of Admiral Caldwell's strategic vision, he said with what appeared to be genuine respect. I see that extended beyond naval operations to the preservation of his legacy. As they prepared to depart, the tide rising to cover the causeway until morning, Margaret signed the preliminary agreements with each partner organization. The Maritime Historical Society would oversee historical preservation and academic access. The Navy would manage appropriate security protocols for sensitive materials. Triton Salvage would conduct professional recovery operations under the initiative's supervision, and Graham's Foundation would provide initial funding with returns from recovery operations supporting long-term sustainability. We'll reconvene in Portland next week to finalize the legal details, Dr. Hayes confirmed, but the framework is sound. This is a remarkable achievement, Miss Sullivan. Left alone in the lighthouse after the representatives departed, Margaret stood at the lantern room windows watching the winter sun set over the Atlantic. Thomas joined her silently, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden light. "You've created something extraordinary here," he said after a long moment. "Not just securing your own future, but honoring Caldwell's legacy in exactly the way he would have wanted." "I had help," Margaret replied, glancing at him with a soft smile. "I couldn't have navigated these waters alone." "You would have found a way," Thomas assured her. "You have the same quality Caldwell must have had, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer purposes." Below them, the waves crashed against the rocky shore in the same rhythm they had maintained for centuries, heedless of human concerns and negotiations. The lighthouse had stood against these waters since 1879, a beacon of safety and guidance through darkness and storm. Now it would serve a new purpose, protecting not just ships at sea, but historical truth and technological innovation, preserved for future generations. 6 months later, on a bright May morning, Margaret stood on the observation deck of the Triton salvage vessel, Poseidon watching as specialized equipment prepared to recover cargo from the SS William Bradford. The recovery operation represented the first major initiative of the now formally established Caldwell Maritime Heritage Foundation, with representatives from all partner organizations present to witness this historic moment. The lighthouse behind her had been transformed in the intervening months. The keeper's quarters now served as both her comfortable home and the operational headquarters for the foundation. The archive room had been professionally renovated with climate-controlled storage and proper research facilities while maintaining its historical character. The underwater passage had been secured with appropriate safety measures and the secondary storage cabinet's contents properly preserved and documented. Most significantly, the lighthouse itself had been fully restored, its brilliant white tower once again serving as a navigational aid for vessels along the Maine coast. The Coast Guard had reinstalled a functioning Fresnel lens, integrating the historic structure into the modern maritime safety system while preserving its architectural integrity. Recovery team reports successful access to the cargo hold, announced the ship's captain over the communication system. Initial assessment confirms presence of specialized containers matching Caldwell's description. Dr. Hayes, standing beside Margaret at the rail, could barely contain her excitement. If the diamond survived intact after 80 years underwater, it validates Caldwell's entire documentation system. His other locations will likely prove equally accurate. Captain Parker, now serving as the Navy's permanent liaison to the Foundation, nodded in agreement. The precision of his record-keeping was legendary within naval intelligence. It's gratifying to see that reputation confirmed. The recovery operation proceeded with methodical care, the specialized containers brought to the surface and transferred to secure processing facilities on the ship. Initial examination could confirm what they had hoped: the industrial diamonds had survived their decades underwater, protected by specialized packaging designed for wartime transport. Preliminary valuation estimates between $28 and $32 million at current market rates, reported the gemological expert brought aboard for the operation. Conservation condition exceeds expectations given the duration of submersion. This successful recovery represented not just financial validation for the Foundation, but historical vindication for Admiral Caldwell's meticulous preservation efforts. The resources generated would fund years of research conservation and further recovery operations, ensuring the complete archive would be properly maintained and utilized. As Margaret watched the careful processing of this historical treasure, she felt a profound sense of rightness, a convergence of past and present personal need and public benefit, individual discovery, and collaborative preservation. What had begun as a desperate bid for affordable housing had evolved into something far more significant: the rescue of a historical legacy that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath the lighthouse stones or fallen into hands that would have exploited rather than honored it. The widow who had spent her last $278 on an abandoned lighthouse had found not just shelter but purpose, becoming the steward of Admiral Caldwell's carefully preserved truth, ensuring it would serve future generations just as he had intended when he created his secret archive decades earlier. That evening, returning to Cape Unity Lighthouse as the spring sunset painted the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The automated light above her began its nightly rotation, sending its beam across the darkening waters as it had for generations before the brief interruption of abandonment. Thomas waited for her on the observation platform, their evening ritual of watching the sunset together, now a comfortable habit that had gradually evolved into something deeper than friendship. At 76, his tall frame was more stooped than when they had first met at the Harbor Cafe, but his blue eyes remained sharp and kind. "Successful day?" he asked, though he had been present for the recovery operation and knew the answer. Beyond all expectations, Margaret confirmed, accepting the thermos of coffee he offered. "The foundation is now financially secure for the foreseeable future. The historical preservation work can proceed without compromise, and the next recovery operation is already being planned." "Admiral Caldwell would be pleased," Thomas observed, "not just with the preservation of his materials, but with how you've balanced all the competing interests while maintaining the integrity of his purpose." Margaret gazed out at the ocean, thinking of the many vessels that had crossed these waters during war and peace, some reaching safe harbor, others lying silent on the seabed with their cargo and crews, their locations precisely documented in the archive below. "When I bought this lighthouse, I was just looking for shelter," she said softly. "Somewhere I couldn't be evicted from, somewhere I could maintain my dignity in difficult circumstances. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Thomas's weathered hand covered hers on the railing, warm and reassuring. "Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. You needed a home, and in finding one, you discovered a purpose larger than yourself." The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening horizon, a silent guardian, continuing its centuries-old mission of guidance and protection. Below, in the stonekeeper's quarters and hidden archive room, Admiral Caldwell's legacy remains secure, no longer a secret, but now a resource for historical understanding, technological appreciation, and recovery of what had been lost. The widow and the lighthouse had found each other at a moment when both faced uncertain futures. Together, they had discovered renewal and purpose that extended far beyond the initial transaction of $278 at a county bankruptcy auction. Some might call it coincidence or luck, but Margaret preferred to see it as something more meaningful, a convergence of need and opportunity, past and present, individual struggle, and broader purpose. As darkness settled over the Atlantic, the lighthouse beam grew more pronounced against the night sky, a steady rhythm of illumination cutting through the darkness. Like truth itself, it required maintenance and protection, but once established, it provided guidance that extended far beyond its immediate surroundings. Margaret Sullivan, lighthouse keeper and guardian of history, had found her beacon. And in preserving Admiral Caldwell's carefully documented truth, she had become a beacon herself, illuminating not just maritime pathways, but the complex intersection of past wisdom and future possibility.